Welcome to another episode of Catalyzing Radical Systemic Change, where in my own language, it's all about discovering, mapping, and cross-pollinating what I think are the necessary steps we need to take as humanity for a planetary civilization ahead. And the header for today's deep conversation, pretty funky one, I reckon, is Unpacking the Psychedelic Renaissance. So I want to roughly sketch that from my side. I'm into the field of what some people call psychedelics. Some people say plant medicine, specifically when they talk about like ayahuasca or San Pedro or peyote or iboga, since 12 years, primarily. And I'm admitting that from my own healing. And today's episode, I think, will be less about my own healing journey, but there's a couple of perceptions that I have about the market. So they say we're in the third wave of the psychedelic renaissance. We will touch upon that later in the podcast. And we see billions of dollars or whatever euros pouring into the market, with all the subsequent second and third layer effects on that. Also, the market is very opaque due to the very nature of the work with the sacred plants being illegal in many countries still. And this is also about to change, as many of the listeners will know. And lastly, maybe, since it is so opaque, there are, to my own understanding, a lot of phony gurus and curanderos and healers out there, and a lot of people that are selling quick fixes. So today, my guest is Hamilton. Hi, Hamilton. I know you're in the field way deeper than myself, and I want to start this podcast with maybe the 2 or 3 defining turning points in your biography that linked you to the realm of psychedelics. Super curious to listen in.
Well, hi, thank you so much for having me. The psychedelic renaissance is in full effect in a very nascent and early stage. And I ultimately got involved in sacred plant medicines in my early 20s. I'm in my mid 40s now, so it was about 22 years ago. I started one of the first healing centers dedicated to Amazonian plant medicine, which also included the sacred plant medicines that were indigenous to the Amazon. But it's important to also focus that it wasn't just about psychoactive plants, but really the entire pantheon of plant medicine that's expressed by the medico-vegetalistas, or the healers of the forest. And in my life, ultimately, I think the key characteristics are that I came from a scientific background. I came from a family that was Western medical, with a father who was a surgeon, a mother who was a nurse. My brother's an attorney in Silicon Valley. And so when I ended up going to the Amazon and seeking these kinds of medicines and knowledge, I came at it from a perspective that was both observational and experiential. And I wasn't looking for a miracle so much as looking for real knowledge that I thought was still out there. I thought that somebody had to have seen through the veil, and that ancient cultures that were still living today might be the means in which to actually discover the people that were still carrying that knowledge from the ancient people to today. And I thought that this might be the last generation that would have that knowledge, and it could die out, and that it needed to be discovered, and if discovered, preserved. I went to the Amazon. That's the second huge turning point in my life, actually going to the Amazon and participating in my first ceremonies, where all of the dreams and visions that I had about that journey ultimately manifested and came true on a tiny river, 24 hours from the nearest city and any kind of Western support, in an area where there upriver from us were literally no inhabitants. And I was told in that first visions that I would actually live there and study there. So that location became an unbelievably important place for me, because it was where I left my Western life and started an Amazonian indigenous life in my early 20s, and also gained the training that helped me cross over that veil that I was looking to see through into the plant medicine space, but in the formal trainings of an apprenticeship to a lineage that had been passed on for literally thousands of years, from just one family member to another, to another, to another, that had survived the conquests and the introduction of Western culture and thinking into that part of the Amazon. And so to go through that experience was very transformational in the sense of I had gone through Western education through the university, and now I was going into an apprenticeship education, and I got to see literally two different minds and two different ways of treating knowledge. And then I think the third part of it was a huge community that formed around our work, which wasn't expected. I thought at best maybe people would come to us for transformation and healing. I wanted to share the plant medicine that I had been shown with the rest of the world, but I didn't know that it was going to create a movement. I didn't know that it was going to spark the neo-shamanic revolution or maybe phase one of the psychedelic renaissance. I didn't know that people would care and come back over and over again. I didn't know the relationships that we would ultimately form as a community, both through specifically Blue Morpho, our organization and community, but then also all of the organizations and communities that formed around these practices. I didn't know that the publicity that we got would spark many different lineages to open up and express themselves into the world and start to share their medicine, because it became a means of surviving and representing their culture and their knowledge. And so being part of that was, I think, something that was truly transformational and very special. I consider it a tremendous honor, but also one of the reasons why I've kind of, since COVID, come out of the shadows to start talking a little bit more about what's going on in this, perceived third wave, and to share some real information, or at least as real as I can, about what's taking place, just so people have a better understanding, less propaganda, and more capacity to make good decisions about how to navigate this.
So I reckon neither one of us wants to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Nevertheless, let's bring in also some of the critical stuff that is happening in the Amazon, because when we see so many tourists coming and so many lineages open up and starting to understand that the best way actually to earn decent money is through plant medicine, what specific ripple effects do you see when you look at the, let's say, closer community in Peru, but also in other countries? Because not all of this is ultimately really helping the indigenous on the one hand, and secondly also how to preserve their like ancient old traditions.
Yeah, I think the hardest thing about it is that you can't differentiate online very easily between one group and another. And so when digital marketing came into the space around 2004, 2005, became really strong in 2006, all of a sudden there were many places online offering different kinds of sacred plant ceremonies. And it really became about the plants that were visionary, like you mentioned, ayahuasca, peyote, San Pedro, iboga, et cetera. It became really about the substance, not about the practices, and about the transformation that people were having. Ultimately, what happened is, like any unregulated industry, an industry formed, first of all, really quickly, which I was shocked and surprised by, and not a proponent for. I thought that this was really something that was like an anthropological niche around traditional medicines, and something about sharing that transformational power with the people. I didn't see this as a, quote, part of the psychedelic renaissance. But what ultimately happened was that out of the woodwork, as soon as there was interest and demand from a financial side, there were people offering these experiences everywhere. And there was a real degradation in the understanding of the training necessary to be able to have these experiences. For instance, when I was trained, you were not allowed to touch the bottle of ayahuasca, literally even touch it, until it was handed to you by the master practitioner or master shaman, who is called a medico vegetalista. So shaman doesn't really apply. They're like doctors of the forest. So this doctor has his medicine like a pharmacist has medicines, and only with a prescription do you actually get it given to you for the purpose of ingesting. That was gone. A Western drug culture started to form around this, like, hey, take this through the trip, you're going to get better. And fundamentally, that was not how it was presented to me. It was presented to me like an unbelievably powerful medicine that could be used for good and actual healing, or it could be used for all different reasons that may not produce the actual transformation that you were looking for. The negative consequences of that are drastic. People having really negative experiences and feeling like they can't come out of them. On the positive side of it, you had, the opening of these medicines to the Western world and a way for the locals to actually be able to support their communities through this knowledge that they had. The negative side of it was that charlatans from everywhere showed up, just everywhere. And then the worst part of it really was that they were using the same word to describe the substances that they were working with. Like the way we make what we call ayahuasca is a recipe that was passed down for thousands of years, one generation to the next, and it was improved upon. And it's very consistent. And you know what's in it, and you know how it's created, and you know that it's safe to be able to drink. And you know that it doesn't have in it any other kinds of admixtures that could make it dangerous. All of a sudden, there was a market for the substance itself, which to us was literal insanity. And people were buying that and having all the negatives that you would hear about from the psychedelic community happening when you all of a sudden took this visionary substance and it was so intense and people didn't know how to navigate it. So the charlatans came out of everywhere. It was very hard to differentiate online who was promoting actual real practices that came from known lineages compared to people that just came out of the woodwork and were ultimately just selling their services as if it were what I called a glorified bartender. So to put it in perspective, for us to graduate, we had to go through anywhere from 5 to 15 years of training. And it depended on how fast an individual could learn. Now, all of a sudden in the market, there were people who literally had no training other than maybe learning how to make a tea and selling this tea as if they were a full-fledged practitioner.
So first of all, I'm really very grateful that we're approaching the whole topic with a high degree of discernment and skepticism, because when I compare ayahuasca, especially ayahuasca, to newbies in the field, I always compare it with a very, very sharp knife. So you can heal something if you cut something out, and if you're trained to do that, right, like a doctor is, but you can also severely hurt yourself, just as a metaphor. Maybe to start finding a common ground when it comes to specifically what you're offering at Blue Morpho. What is a minimum viable, safe and sound container for people that feel drawn towards healing, towards ingesting sacred medicine? What's a minimum viable structure that you say, it's not about promoting your place, but kind of what are the check boxes that you recommend people should check before they go into ceremony?
Yeah, I think that's really important. First of all, you want to know the intentions of the location where you're going, not just the intentions of like a safe professional place, but the actual intentions of the practitioners. And the best way to do that is to find out others and the experience that they had, and or talk with them yourself. But we're very open about that at Blue Morpho. We fundamentally say we're here to fulfill your intentions. And so that was something that I came up with, sort of like a bridge of logic, where I didn't have to have individual intentions for that session or that ceremony, but everybody came with their intentions. So my intention was to give maximum effective transformation, maximum realization of your intentions, so that we would always be aligned. And those intentions wouldn't only come from your mind, but they would actually come from your heart. And even deeper than that, sort of like your connection to source or your connection to soul. So it would be something that was truly innate and positive and beneficial to you, and something that I could support in a very direct way, even without having to know the individual intentions for people who, are gaining trust and they don't want to open up so much. So intention, I think, is unbelievably important. The second part is knowing the track record that the people have. Like how much experience do they have? For instance, not to say that new people in the space don't deserve an opportunity to also get to share, but experience in sense that then if they're new, what training do they have, and how much experience do they have personally? Like in our lineage, you're considered interesting to the practitioners when you have 1,000 ceremonies of experience. So as an apprentice, when you get to amass 1,000 ceremonies, that's when you're sort of looked at again, or that's when you're considered to have graduated to another level. Well, that typically takes somewhere between 10 and 15 years. That's if you're practicing full time at over 100 ceremonies a year. And that's not just personal training ceremonies. Those all have to be ceremonies where you're actually working, performing, the tribal medicines, or healing people, or ultimately supporting their growth and development. So I think looking at the track record, then the quality of the ability, if you're going to have a larger ceremony, what kind of support are there? How well did they have that organized? There's the ceremonies that take place literally just sitting in the forest, and there are ceremonies and infrastructure that's created specifically for the ceremony. You want that to actually be supportive of your ceremony. So we have special built infrastructure where there's enough bathrooms, for instance, for everybody. We have support staff of the people who are fully trained, like I am, and then we have fully trained other kind of support staff, very much where you'd think of like a surgeon and nurses. So we have staff like that are there, and then we also have local staff that are just supporting the orchestration of the ceremony to actually help you get to a bathroom or back, or be able to change your bucket if you vomited, or can provide you another blanket. So there's a question around, how that space is actually being maintained. I think they also want to look at the intention of the ceremony itself. Like, our intention is to minimize the negative effects on you physically, so that it's actually the easiest on you. It's not this bravado and ego about how intense the experience is going to be and how much somebody's going to vomit. That's like the exact opposite idea. We want you to have a cleanse, literally a cleanse. It's a transformation for you. So think about it. If you were like a snow globe, and we're going to shake it up as hard as you possibly can and just destroy you, that's sort of one technique that people use, which we don't. We use the technique where we're very gentle with you, but very profound, because we believe the deeper you can go inside, and the deeper you can go into your own experience, the deeper you can go into that very, very deep calm, create like a Satori kind of experience for you, this enlightened, blissful state, that from there, the visions can become 10 out of 10. You can receive the most. If you're tense, you can't receive, you can't let go. There's this talking about letting go. Well, we want you to be already letting go. We want you to be fully trusting of that experience. And so that's a technique that we've developed over the last 20 years to provide really maximum support and effectiveness of the ceremonies. I think it's also important to understand language. And if somebody's there who can speak your language and really translate for you, so that you can be heard and you can express yourself and know that you're being understood in your language. So all of those things combined, I think, are incredibly important. It's how we've built our container. And I think the final part is, do they teach you how to hold the container? There's this idea that the practitioner is supposed to hold the container, but the truth is everybody in the room needs to hold the container. And one of the things we do is that we provide a lot of support even before people come on the retreat, to learn about the container that we hold, how everybody's going to behave in the ceremony, what the guidelines are for safety, how we're going to do this so that everybody is a responsible party to that container and creates really the most optimal conditions for themselves and everybody else that's part of the retreat.
Just trying to circle that back from my own background. So I started with the visionary plant medicine relatively late in my biography, at the age of 32. But I went into like monasteries and sit with spiritual teachers. And for me, it was very important, to read a book about the teacher and then try to understand like the lineage and the framework, and then do a research on the retreat center. And then usually my first spiritual teacher I met was Williges Jäger. I reckon he was already in his like mid 60s or 70s. Maybe he died at the age 98. He was like a Benedictine monk and a Zen Buddhist. And it was pretty obvious when the guy entered the room after 40 years of like sitting and having spent, I don't know, tens of thousands of hours or hundreds of thousands of hours in like deep meditative states, that this was a real master, at least to me, and at least also how he was and is portrayed in literature. So maybe for those of you listening, just be humble, do your research before you embark on such a profound transformational experience. Since today, I don't want to only focus on quote unquote work with plant medicine, but I feel like I wanna wrap that up. Is there a specific, like Lego blocks? Are there like specific parts within a framework, both in your own framework and also in other frameworks, that you think people should take into account before they start working with quote unquote visionary plant medicine? I tell you my own background. I really think there's a truth in quote unquote psychotherapy. I'm not saying everybody needs to do psychotherapy like I did, but I always explain people like a psychedelic experience kind of disassembles your egoic structure or your autopoietic system, and then systemic work through whatever different modalities and types and different frameworks of psychotherapy, for example, or family constellation work, can really beautifully complement that. So I'm curious to listen in. What are the different again, maybe Lego blocks within a process design that you think are important?
I think the most important thing is that you find a framework that resonates with you. I think the hardest thing is to import a framework that you just don't connect with. So some are very mental and some are very complicated and some are actually very heart-centered and very simple. I think like the easiest framework for going into all psychedelic experiences is make it about your true intentions, make it about heart and source, make it about a deeper and more profound state of consciousness. And if any healing comes up that you need to go through in that ceremony, just embrace it, receive it. That's why you're there. So I saw so many people over the years scared to actually receive the transformation and the healing. I thought, like, this is a graduation. If you're there for a transformation, that's not the negative part. You've already lived through the negative part. So then we were people getting ready to go to the ceremony and just starting to have anxiety and fear about what could possibly happen. The great part is about to happen, but we have to go into the heart to be able to have it that way, because the mind can become chaotic in that experience. I think also for psychedelics, it's important to awaken the imagination. So a lot of people don't do this part of it. They don't understand that just, in the week before going, or even a little longer if you want to, do meditations, but where you're actually really imaginative. Like, do a meditation with a flower and imagine every single aspect of the flower, look at it at the whole flower, individual pieces, see if you can zoom all the way in on the pollen, get that in your mind, move away from the flower and see if you can recreate all of that in your imagination. So many people are so linear thinking that they don't understand that part of this is another part of the brain. Psilocybin journeys are so incredible for awakening the whole brain function and getting that aspect of the visionary context going. But it's not just an intellectual linear process. It requires really the rest of the brain to open up. So if you do that work before, or that practice before going into the ceremony, it's just that much easier to get it going. The other part of it, I think, is look at frameworks that are really about focusing on a progression and transformation instead of becoming identified in the process that you're in. So I see one of the big things happening now, which I'm highly questioning, is why people are moving into quote unquote healing, and then they say they're healing for so long. For us, healing was a very acute, short-lived part of the process. There would be times when we would need to heal again. Things happen in life, but when you would come, especially to ayahuasca ceremony, we could get through the healing part in anywhere from 3 to 10 journeys. You could be completely done with it. That could take one person maybe in their lifetime a year if they're really dedicated to it. Come, have healing journeys, integrate it. Come another time, have healing journeys, integrate it. The healing part's done. Now we move on to the expansion and the learning and the growing part. So that's kind of a framework. Like healing, you start with healing, but healing can move very, very quickly. Then you integrate. And then from that integration, you move to about learning and knowledge and consciousness expansion, the transformation through a series of ceremonies.
I find it particularly interesting that you were mentioning a sequence. I think there's a part to heal, there's a part to grow, and there's also a part where we utterly need more people showing up from their full potential. When you look back at the last 20 years, and then we will slightly tweak the discourse more like on to the psychedelic renaissance itself, because I know you're playing like different parts in the cosmic chessboard, so to say, as do I. But when you look at your own understanding of what serves best the process of people, how has your own approach changed over the last years?
Oh, it's changed tremendously, beautifully. I think if you embrace the idea that we continue to learn forever, which isn't really part of the psychedelic renaissance, it's kind of more from the Eastern philosophical side. So if you kind of embrace this forever learning, forever growing, you can reach different states along the way, but they continue to evolve. It gives you this capacity to accept sort of evolutionary creativity, that you're always going to be evolving and growing. And in our case, I took the time that COVID brought to us, which was the first interruption in our work in 19 years, as an opportunity to step away from the space a little bit and have that time to go inward and really reflect on everything that had changed during the period of time. And I was actually shocked. There were so many pieces that I discovered that I had missed along the way, just in the daily flow of work, life, and support of the community, that you just don't even see. Part of it was just the tremendous expansion and growth that had taken place globally, because we were kind of myopically focused just on our own work, and we weren't seeing the massive expansion of this everywhere else. It led me to an opportunity to really reflect on everything that we do and the way that we do it. And I support the idea of taking a life inventory where you're just completely honest. There's no color to what you're describing. You just put it down in a list and categorize it and just make an entire inventory of everything, about every detail about how you do this work, and how you share this work, and how you show up for the work, and how you build the container around it, so much on the side of logistics and location and lodging, to the actual ceremonies themselves and the preparation of the medicines. And I actually decided to improve every aspect of it. So every place where we saw conflict, or every place where we had made compromises over the years, I looked to see if we could actually improve upon that, so that we could be more impactful, so that we could be more beneficial, and that we could ultimately support the people who participate with us in a deeper way. And that brought a number of different tweaks. For instance, for 20 years, I only worked with one kind of ayahuasca that we would create ourselves. It was sort of our brew. It was the Blue Morpho brew. And now I'm working with 4. So in that process, I actually discovered 3 other recipes to use. I have one that I call light, because some people just don't need such an intense ayahuasca. We were known as having a very, very intense brew. So now I have one called light. I have one called breakthrough, which, for people who find that they're stagnant in their energy and it's hard for them to get into the ecstatic state, into the visionary state, it actually causes that breakthrough. I have one called integration, that doesn't produce vision. So when somebody has had a very intense visionary night, they don't need to go through that again. They need a way to integrate and process it. And I think this is much more effective than having to just drink a drop of ayahuasca, or less than a teaspoon, and just basically sit there in ceremony and meditate. This recipe allows for people to know they're not going to go into the visionary state with it, but they are going to be able to go into the trance. They are going to be able to get the benefit from the ayahuasca itself, and they're going to be able to navigate it with a tremendous amount of more comfort and capacities. And so all of that came through this inventory of really thinking about how we could bring greater sophistication and precision to the work that we're doing, how we could make it just better for everybody. I wanted the container to be even stronger. We held a very strong container and worked on it for many, many years. And so I actually, I saw that over the years, our container had shifted a little bit. The culture around our work had shifted a little bit, which is natural, that people, as they come and become part of the community, also share and shift the culture. And so I actually brought back some of the elements that I used back in 2004, 2005, 2006. It led to a tremendous transformation in the cohesion for everybody in the room. I started bringing back not just the individual journey, but the collective journey, and really making the collective journey a focal point for everybody. So not everybody getting in the individual aspects of the experience for each other, but getting into the collective idea, like each person has a role in the collective, and we're all together. And it's not so hierarchical in the room, and we're all there supporting it. And I'm guiding that for everybody, kind of like a great orchestra. So I'm functioning as a maestro of the orchestra of the entire ceremony for everybody, not just of the plants, and teaching people how to be able to, in very short number of ceremonies, become responsible for themselves in the room, as well as helping hold that collective space. That led to a breakthrough experience I had actually never had. And the last retreat, it was really amazing, where the ceremony got a little chaotic because people were complaining that it was actually so cohesive. They wanted a little more of what they had heard about, like where things get kind of really intense. And so I brought it up to that level of intensity. And normally at that point, there's a lot more purging, and there's a kind of, some just more agitation can come up. And normally you would have to just let that naturally progress down over a course of a couple hours. In this case, we were actually able to like literally stop the ceremony, collectively reset. Everybody turned down the fear that they were creating. Everybody turned down the chaos and agitation collectively. Everybody was able to go back into like a reset of the ceremony itself. And that night we literally had two ceremonies. We had the one to fulfill what they were looking for, and then we were actually able to start the ceremony over and have the one that I wanted to hold for everybody, which was ultimately much deeper and healing. So they got to have both experiences. That's unheard of, that I know of, to be able to actually have that kind of reset take place, at least in our work. And so that was all evolution and benefit to what we've done over the last years.
Since we spent a lot of time talking about the ceremonial space, let's jump on a different level of aggregate, because I know you're involved in a lot of different endeavors. Where do you see the market moving? What are the different, like, say, leverage points, or sometimes I also call them acupuncture points, where you see both with your expertise and your network, you can make a difference, and hopefully not towards creating like more business models that just create more externalities and don't honor the wisdom ultimately that we get from these cultures. So let's just start to weave a tapestry where we then can riff off together.
Yeah, I think fundamentally what we've seen is competitive capitalism in the last 50 to 100 years has just taken over. I usually go back to sort of main turning points in technology and history. And so when I go back to is World War II, and I just see that since then, this idea of corporate capitalism, competitive capitalism has expanded in a tremendous way globally. I think what I like to think that the work can do, that we're doing, as well as others like you, and as the community grows, is an idea of conscious capitalism. And that we can ultimately awaken people who have real experience in this, business leaders, corporation leaders, innovators, startup people, founders of companies, et cetera, to just have a deeper conscious awareness about themselves and the impact that they're making with their innovation. So I think if the world has gone in ways that are both positive and negative, we can affect the negative aspects of it with the same level of innovation and interest and desire that we ultimately created those problems out of. I think we have to take responsibility that all the problems in the world that are human related are human created. And so I think with the idea of working with people who have other kinds of experiences, business experience, et cetera, or finance experience, that the natural awakening and consciousness, the natural transformation and healing that takes place allows for this shift to conscious capitalism. And I think the most important part of it is a knowledge and awareness of what's going to come out of the innovations, what's going to come out of the impact that those companies have on people, on the collective mind, on the consumer, and on the environment. And I just don't think that was ultimately part of the last wave of capitalism. This will be the next wave of it. And the influence will have a global ripple effect.
I have the feeling this is a natural segue. So there's a part in me that's excited and feels compelled towards just saying, yeah, hooray, more leaders awake, and there's a pathway towards a more conscious way of doing capitalism. But there's also the notion that I sense a lot of people who had awakening experiences are still getting sucked up into the old extractive paradigm, maybe because they have too much skin in the old game, and just use like the efficiency and the profound healing they received to just be more successful in business. So there seems to be a fine line between those who have an awakening experience and to really change their biographies, whether it be from mainstream investing towards impact investing or whatever. But there's also a high degree of what I would call, to coin just a term from Chögyam Trungpa, spiritual materialism and spiritual narcissism, because these deeply profound experiences that were reserved to a very, very tiny segment of the population, and usually also only given to those who were passing for like a decade plus of apprenticeship and then passed on as really a sacred testament, can now be smoked in a 5-MeO DMT pipe. So we're not talking about 5-MeO DMT today, but what I wanted to say was that for me also, it was really with surprise, maybe also 3 to 5 years maximum ago, that I suddenly saw, oh, I'm not only part of this circle. It seems like millions of people in all big metropolitan areas around the planet are doing that. But then often when I speak to the people, I see too little really radically committed towards creating the new paradigm, whether we call it regenerative paradigm or you were talking about conscious capitalism. And a lot of them really just kind of getting the mana, but abusing it almost towards just being more successful. So I know this is a complex topic, but just curious on your own thoughts.
It is complex. Just like when we saw the first movement of this from people who had long-term lineages and were practitioners just for the locals to charlatans coming up from everywhere, there's same things happening now just with the rest of the world. And so around this idea of actual awakening. So you can use these plants to increase narcissism. You can use the plants to increase the ego. You can fortify the ego with it. You can train the ego with it. If you don't bring in the teachings and the trainings that ultimately awaken a person to a fundamental shift from being completely brain dominant to brain heart balanced, you will get that increase in ego and that increase in narcissism. It's a natural effect of this. What I think about it long term, though, isn't the individual and what that person's doing. I actually don't think it's a bad thing to have an acceleration of the predatory form of capitalism take place, because that is a pressure. It's like an evolutionary pressure on consciousness to ultimately have to out innovate it. And what will happen is ultimately awakening around the world in first sporadic locations, but that can become ultimately the next wave beyond it. And that the innovators and creators who right now might be innovating and creating, we don't hear of how they're utilizing these awakenings to be able to do this, are actually making those changes. And I see it a lot in the Web3 world, blockchain world, NFT world, the use of psychedelics as a way of creating really next generation geometry, next generation computer science, next generation networks, and what could become the internet of the future. So I see this idea that could create pressure. Obviously, in the minute, in the right now, it's kind of a negative aspect of it. I also think that aspect of consciousness where people are becoming that greater version of the narcissist is very short-lived. It's a branch of the evolutionary tree that Earth itself ultimately forces to die out, simply because it can't sustain itself. You can't have the species competing with the same species about a kind of external growth and development, whether it be business growth and development or financial growth and development. Ultimately, the Earth outpaces that kind of paradigm, not that paradigm outpaces the Earth. It's a complete misunderstanding of the use of the Earth. The Earth is permitting it. Right now, the Earth permits this kind of capitalism. The moment the Earth won't permit it anymore, it can't happen anymore. So I was actually watching a video last night on Elon Musk where he was describing the importance of moving to renewable energy, but at the same time, he was saying the impact that they made is that all the car companies now are making electric vehicles, but there's still such a wide range and necessitated range to go. But at the same time, I think it's not just Elon doing that, it's the Earth doing that through Elon. Right. So the Earth is forcing the other, just like the Earth created the pollution, the Earth is also now forcing the change. So you bring what you're doing, you bring what I'm doing, you bring another 100 of us, what we're doing, and the work that we're going to do with the next 10,000, 15,000 people, the seeds within those people that represent the change makers are going to be awakened, and they're going to come out of that. And they're going to then create a ripple effect that starts to create that transformation and allow that notion of greater consciousness to what we're doing.
I'm curious on the connection of awakening, new ways of leadership, new ways of creating regenerative business models, especially when it comes to Web3. Since after the podcast is given out, I know you're the founder of multiple companies and behind a lot of nodes in the network. So could you briefly sketch, and maybe not briefly, why especially the focus on these endeavors, and where do you see the ripple effects taking place, and also maybe where they are standing and what support do they need?
Well, fundamentally, I got involved in technology around the idea of maximum impact. And I just had an understanding that if the majority of people are in a kind of fear-oriented desperation around money and capitalism, that it isn't possible for them to have expansion in consciousness, because that day-to-day living, and that's the way everyone was in the Amazon, just requires you to live hand to mouth, to make the next day's coin, to be able to spend it all that same day, and that there needed to be ultimately inroads into finance and business that could help shift this idea of how money was distributed and how people made a living. And I saw in the developing nations, there was an unbelievable expansion of the use of technology. Literally any way people could use technology to help make money, they were doing it. And so I thought, okay, let's not look at that in 5 years. Let's look at that in 20 years, 40 years, 60 years. The developing nations are going to become technologically the most advanced nations in terms of the use of the technology, maybe not the creation of it, but the use of that technology. And so now take that idea and wind that back to this exploration inside these visionary realms. What I ultimately came to realize was that the sacred geometry and these patterns that are being seen and the visions that people are having is ultimately a kind of linguistics. And I got really interested in the linguistics of the visions themselves. We would use these chants called ikuro in the ceremony. They create catalyst for change and healing. They create connection of different kinds of energy, and it's palpable, it's visual. So I came to ultimately understand that literally higher dimensional thinking, like in the terms of math, like dimension 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, could be codified in the visionary realms through an advancement in linguistics. And so I started to create that linguistics to be able to codify that. That became a kind of a nexus between blockchain-based Web3 oriented computer systems, which were really a combination of people, computers, and fiber optics and satellites from around the world. If you could envision that, like kind of go into outer space and envision all of that at the same time, you would see a much higher expression of dimensionality around human interaction, communication, and connection about how it was really taking place. And then if you got really into the light, like into the quantum of the fiber optics themselves, and how that living network was actually, living, breathing, creating, growing, and how it was expressing new distribution of thought, new distribution of innovation and creativity. I thought that was a very pliable, very elastic form of technology to be able to try to make this greater impact. And so that's when I got really interested in Web3, smart contracts, NFTs, ERC20 tokens as a way of distributing wealth through the nature of those networks, and started to innovate in that space. So I actually, from my community, tried to get together what I thought were the brightest minds and most innovative thinkers from all different verticals, from education and the economy, to get together. So finance, CEOs, business owners, startup guys, scientists, quantum physicists, mathematicians, et cetera. I got chemists, I got everybody together that we could, and just said, okay, let's go into vision and see what we can come up with. And the first project that we came up with was to unlock the value of creativity. And so we got really interested in the creator economy and the idea of the value of creativity. And I just had a economic thesis that the amount of restricted creativity was actually worth more than the creativity that was being used in the markets today. So the excluded creativity that you'll never see in the market because it's excluded is actually worth more than the probably 50 to hundreds of trillions of dollars of global market of creativity that's actually going into the markets. of the $4 quadrillion economy. And so I just said, wow, okay, we need to find a way to harness this creativity and provide value to this creativity. And so as a think tank, we started to muse on that, and we created a number of models, and those models are now in their final stage of coding and getting ready to be released. And we're just looking for the appropriate times to bring them to market.
I want to sense into the multidimensionality of Web3. And for me, it also feels as if what we have seen from Web 1, static web pages, kind of basically PDFs to read, to Web 2, okay, we now got social networks, to Web 3, where we become the conscious creators of the infrastructure itself, and the infrastructure itself creates whole new ways of creating value flows, monetary flows, IP, network effects, networks of networks. So I'm curious if we can create a metaphor, or maybe the common North Star of what we want to birth onto this planet. Because I really have the feeling for the first time we can create a technological mesh layer with what Gaia created through us as the biological beings, that's maybe not equally complex, but sophisticated and complex enough as to be able to encode the entanglement of everything that is, because we know through our visionary ceremonies, but also as a lived experience thereafter, that ultimately everything is entangled. But so far, like math, when we think of the old paradigm, which I think is really one of the main problems, creates like subject-object duality, causality, and then externalizes and enslaves not only, quote unquote, the global south, but mainly enslaves the many generations, hopefully, of like human and non-human beings on this beautiful planet called Earth. So this was a lot of this, were a lot of words falling out of my mouth, but I'm curious if we can give this multidimensionality that we're both envisioning, some more tangible ways.
Sure. So I try to look at it from the macro and then from the micro. So I kind of try to make my mind like a telescope, and only I put myself in outer space looking back at the Earth. So when I do that, what I see is in the macro, I see a web, but it's not just a web of like the way you think of a mesh, like a fishing net. I see a web, or like the way clothes is woven. The way I see the web is that it actually is 3D, and then in time it's 4D. So the web itself is a construct of nodes that are actually passing through the Earth itself. They go around the Earth, and then the satellites go even around that. So I see this encapsulation of satellites. I see through the Earth itself. It's not on the Earth or over the Earth. It's actually through the Earth, passes all the fiber optics. And the fiber optics move to these centralized centers and then data centers around the world. You can find maps of these data centers in these fiber optic cables just Googling it. So then you see this basic free flow of information that's going through that in the form of light and the form of electricity. And then it ultimately comes to, really these server farms. And I think a lot of people don't understand that most of Web3 is maintained in server farms. It's not maintained in individual computers. Like when we run our nodes so that they're always online 24 hours a day, they're run through server farms, and we use our own individual terminals as the way to be able to connect with them, program them, set all the settings, et cetera, and let them work. Then you see those connected through the individual terminals, people's phones and people's laptops and tablets and stuff. And then I think the part that most people don't see, now this is kind of getting into the micro, right? We've gone from the macro all the way down into the micro, is that you and I are not separated right now by technology. You and I are connected by the technology. So my eyes are actually part of my brain. My eyes connect to the optic nerve that goes directly into my brain. And what I can't see from the side, but I am seeing directly in relationship to me, is actually a waveform that's coming through the pixels of part of the screen that I'm on. So there's actually a wave interaction to the pixels themselves. The pixels are now connected through wave interaction to the Wi-Fi. The Wi-Fi is connected through wave interaction to the towers. The towers are connected to the fiber optics. And that's actually creating an unbroken connection between us right now. It's unbelievable. It's uninterrupted. It's unbroken. That is an interaction. That is an energetic interaction. That is a quantum interaction. It's a truly viable scientific interaction. And if you now take just the interaction we're having, and now you multiply it by 1 billion people, then you multiply it by 2 billion people, you multiply it by 3 billion people, all moving through that network itself has taken on an extraordinary form of both architecture and geometry. So now if we move all the way back out into outer space, now let's leave that network with all of us. Let's leave the interconnection. Let's allow the energy and the waveform to be there. But in our imagination, let's remove the rest of the matter of the earth. Okay, let's actually remove it. We see that in the density of earth itself, where there would have been land, are now just people connected to the terminals, connected to this network. And then around them, encapsulated them, are these satellites. And that is an extraordinary form of geometry right there. That is a multidimensional field of consciousness that is being explored and expressed between people in real time. That's a fundamental miracle. The fact that we've created that without even thinking that was going to be the shape that it is, and it's pliable, it's morphing. You don't have to just be sitting connected to lines. It's Wi-Fi. So now in it, people are flying and they're still connected. People are on trains, it's still connected. People are in cars, it's still connected. That people are moving around the cities in these clusters. Like if you look at the Earth from outer space, just looking at like Earth from nighttime, where you see the satellite images of where there's the most electricity, and you just see these, population density centers around the world. People are moving through it. It's like a swarm. It's like a hive swarm of energy that's taking place, that's moving this collective consciousness and zeitgeist, right? I don't think the Web 2 version of it is all that flow ends up at a corporation, where there's a manipulation around the nature of the flow for the needs of the corporation. What's interesting about Web3 is it's just nullifying those corporate hubs. It's using some certain corporate hubs, like around how you actually get the internet connection itself, and who owns the fiber optic cables, et cetera. It's using aspects of it, but the control of information is not directly related to individual corporate hubs at every step. So you actually see this massive flow of peer-to-peer starting to take place. And the peer-to-peer understanding that's taking place is where that technology can actually take on its own collective consciousness, right? That's the real emergence point of what we're talking about, where Gaia can now express itself in an entire new way, and we don't even know what that will ultimately look like. The consciousness flow through that will represent all of the ways that we've currently codified consciousness, which are all of the ways that the political and capitalist systems and education systems fundamentally function. That's like the core of the codification of consciousness, is all the ways humans are using consciousness and language and their mind right now. What we don't see is what's going to emerge from this. And this is only 3, 4, 5 years old, right? So think about when the first Internet 1.0 started at 3, 4, 5 years into it, what it is now 25 years into it, or 30 years into it. This peer-to-peer expression of exchange, interaction, communication, hardware, software, and understanding language and consciousness, all of a sudden creates a collective mind share that wasn't there, a collective intention that wasn't there before, a collective drive that wasn't there before. But I think in the earliest states, what I'm seeing is an understanding that there's more commonality between us than separation between us or differentiation between us globally as a collective species, and that there's a collective need for well-being, and there's a connective need to share ownership, and there's a collective need to share the responsibility of maintaining important systems and not just putting that responsibility on somebody else. And there's a collective need to develop the next generation societies, next generation cities, next generation finance, next generation money. And that's all very progressive in terms of innovation. So this is the first time in my life that I've actually seen a global community coming together about radical systemic change, but doing it in a way that's truly evolutionary. And how important that is, that collectively that understanding is moving through the collective consciousness all at the same time.
So we can't look into a crystal ball, but I love this exercise. So since we now, as a species, we're recording this live during COP27. So we become aware as a species, painfully, that we kind of messed it up, right? Kind of like when an adolescent, at least I did stuff like that, gets wickedly drunk, and has a hangover. Kind of, we messed it up. We didn't like completely fuck it up yet. So we become aware as a species that we need to make a move towards a planetary civilization. It's not only Alistair or Hamilton, people at UNDP, at various think tanks, even impact investors, institutional investors. There's a ton of people talking about that. So when we look at the planetary civilization ahead, which I think still the two of us will witness, right? It's just a gut feeling, might also take a couple of generations. My gut feeling is we will witness the birthing of the planetary civilization with all the good, the bad, and the ugly, and secondary and tertiary, effects, unintended consequences. If you cook down your expertise, you're wrestling with the psychedelic renaissance, and you couple it with the best of the intentions and the community that you have in the Web3 space, what do you see emerging maybe on a horizon 1, let's say the next 1-2 years, a horizon 2, 3 to 5 years, horizon 3, let's say maybe next 10 years?
Well, on level 1, I think it's regulation. Regulation comes into the space and it starts to shape it. And it starts to say, hey, in the face of innovation, you still have to understand and follow certain core rules that the global society has and have already established. And so there's a maturation that takes place in the technology, but also an understanding that many of the projects that originally came out are just fundamentally illegal and they're not allowed to continue. So there's a sort of a triage that takes place naturally within the projects of those that can survive and those that don't. And that gives it a fundamental shape. The 3 to 5 years is an embracing fundamentally of this technology by everybody. It becomes institutional, becomes truly institutional for the good and the bad associated with that. I just think the capitalist profit motive makes it very simple to think that every single possible way that profit can be made, it will. And then through that, there's a natural evolution of shape and form. So all the thinkers who are thinking, how can we benefit from this, do. And then I think in like the 5 to 10 year range, and even longer, is where these very early original thinkings around truly global civilization becomes possible. Because there's such a shift in the need of thought collectively. There's such a shift in the need of identity collectively. And I think there also has to be an understanding that this transformation is evolutionary. It's not revolutionary. So the only things we've been taught about this in the past is revolution, which leads to other kinds of war. It leads to other kinds of fear and dominance in that sense. That is not what this is about. This is about a kind of a global civilization that actually leaves city-state governments in place. It doesn't change that fundamentally. It doesn't take away the old financial systems and only leaves the new ones. It's a hybridization of technology that takes place over time that's fundamentally not threatening to capitalism. Capitalism and democracy allows for a natural evolution as long as it stays within the rules of the governing parties. I don't see that any different in this case. There's a natural evolution associated to the rules, and then there's also a natural evolution of the technology and the way that it's implemented. So I think this takes shape and form. At first it's just a flurry, and it kind of has booms and busts as it goes, but the need of it will never go away. The desire for peer-to-peer interaction will never go away. The technology cannot be controlled, the use of it in terms of peer-to-peer interactions anyway. So that aspect of it is here to stay. The beauty of the idea of this globalized civilization is that it actually grows through the current structures. It doesn't replace them. So it does fundamentally change them, but through a natural evolution and mutation of those structures, And I think that those will be the technologies that really stick. Anything that's revolutionary will ultimately go. Lots of the technologies that are big today, like Bitcoin and Ethereum, I think like those may become sort of dinosaurs of the market, and the next generation thought will actually be the ones that are the largest projects in history associated with it. Sort of the first, like the next wave become the next version of the largest ones. I welcome literally all of it.
So I have a couple of takeaways, which actually are a beautiful mirror of myself. First of all, choose your gurus wisely, or your curanderos, your healers. Do a proper desk research. Ask your friends. If you don't have friends, do an extensive, desk research on visionary plant medicine. And secondly, for anybody out there who thinks they can still miss out on educating themselves on quote unquote that huge hashtag Web3, better educate yourself. Start watching some YouTube videos, download some podcasts, because the evolution of the internet, where we're in the early stages still, but it will, in as much with all the good, the bad, and the ugly, as Web 2 has disrupted the way whole societies work, that our consciousness is hacked, that our attention span is like harvested. In the same sense, for the good, the bad, and the ugly, Web3 will transmute the infrastructures on which our modern day lives sit. And with modern day lives, I literally mean as well the modern day lives of many indigenous, because I've not been with you in Peru, but I helped the Huni Kuin. And I mean, they're also all having their smartphones,
For
so
sure.
there is really no way back. There is no retro romantic version of us taking the leap towards a planetary civilization. And I know some adherents of, let's say, eco villages, which is totally fine, ditch that and say ultimately, it's like kind of going back to the medieval ages and all becoming a web of like eco villages. I think what we're seeing is more like you mentioned, this like transmutation. I see it more like a mycelium of like tech, biological, and conscious infrastructure all entangled that transmutes the system that we want to outlive. These were a lot of words. Do you have some final words?
Actually, I agree with all of that. I think that what you described as the convergence of biotech and chemistry and the plant world, the plant kingdoms, and technology all ultimately creates this convergence of new consciousness for the planet. I actually think that that is the next step, where we're not just the dominant form of consciousness, but we actually help create through the earth itself new consciousness. And I agree completely that getting educated on all of the subjects that we discussed today is unbelievably important, because they are the next evolutionary pieces of what's coming, both for technology, for global humanity, and for our consciousness, because the psychedelic renaissance is here, and people are dabbling and practicing and using these substances in ways at a level never before used. And so I think all of this will be an incredible exploration. Being part of it is a tremendous honor. And I think all of us need to get educated on it so that we have a better understanding and foundation as we navigate the next 15, 20 years with it.
Hamilton, thanks so much for the conversation.
Amazing.